Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Luis Fernandez. Community activists from Western North Carolina voiced their frustrations at the U.S. Capitol on Monday. They are upset about the slow pace of Hurricane Helene recovery relief, which they blame on the federal government. Meanwhile, Governor Josh Stein's Advisory Committee on Western North Carolina Recovery, a bipartisan group of state and local officials in charge of Helene recovery goals, are pretty upset as well. Joining me now is WRAL state government reporter Will Doran, who's covering it all. Will, thanks for being here.
Luis, nice to talk to you.
So you've been dialed in on this for a while now, Will, but for those unaware, why are both of these groups so upset?
Well, Helene was the worst natural disaster to ever hit North Carolina in terms of number of people dead, amount of damage done. So the recovery to it, everyone has always acknowledged, is going to be a years-long process. But the thought is that in this first year plus, we're now near 15 months after the storm hitting Western North Carolina, that we just haven't really seen the pace of recovery that we need to see in those early days and months to set the stage for a successful long-term recovery. If you don't get started on the basics early, then that's just going to, it's going to be a domino effect. It's going to drag on and delay other things down the road. So you've got these folks, both, the community groups who are going up to D.C. to make, their speeches, talk to members of Congress, then also the people you mentioned, the county commissioners, the state lawmakers, the mayors, the state officials who are on the ground dealing with the nitty-gritty of this on the governor's committee, and they're all pointing the finger at the Trump administration and saying that we are just not seeing the kind of urgency that we want to see, that we need to see coming out of D.C. on this.
So where does funding stand right now? Is there like what is currently had and what the goal is to have?
Exactly. We know that recovery is going to be a multi-billion-dollar process, and the federal government isn't expected to pick up the entire tab, but historically it's picked up half or more of the recovery dollars. I mean, you look at, other major storms throughout U.S. history, and the feds have always picked up the share of, at least 50, but often, with storms like, Maria and Sandy and Katrina, these really big storms like Helene was, the feds have picked up, 60, 70, 75% of the cost. And with Helene, it's like 10% that has been paid for so far. And, of course, it's not fully finished yet, but, so hopefully that number will go higher, but it's very low. And so what they're seeing is just we haven't gotten the money that we would normally expect to be receiving from FEMA.
Humor me on this one here, because I feel like I'm asking very basic questions, but how does this funding speed impact these communities trying to recover directly? How you mentioned a domino effect. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, there's basically two different problems. And the first is with just the immediate recovery work. The storm comes through, causes all these landslides out there in Western North Carolina. They've got to clear away the mud, move away the trees, rebuild the roads and bridges, replant fields, rebuild sidewalks, restring wires, all of this work. And a lot of that's already been done. And so typically what happens throughout, most of modern U.S. history is the local communities pay for that. The cities and the counties or the state, usually though the cities and the counties, just pay for all of that work to get done. And then the feds come in and then they reimburse them. Maybe they'll reimburse 100% of the cost, maybe it's 90%, whatever. But they pick up at least most of the bill, if not all of it. But that hasn't happened, or at least not to the extent that a lot of these communities want. So they're heading now into a new year. They're saying, hey, we got to pay our firefighters, our policemen, our school teachers. We got to keep our parks up and running. We got to keep the street sweepers going. But we don't have the money because we spent it all on hurricane relief thinking that we would get it back from the feds, and now we are just out of money. So that's one big problem that a lot of local governments are running into. And the second problem is money that hasn't been spent at all, and that's largely for rebuilding homes. You need the feds' help to rebuild the homes because the state doesn't really pay for that. That's funded by the federal government, or things like disaster mitigation, making sure that the next time we have a storm that it's not as bad as Helene was. So, when you are rebuilding homes, rebuilding them to withstand floods, or rebuilding the bridges and the dams in a different way so that they'll be, more immune to landslides in the future. And a lot of that money just hasn't been approved at all. We heard today, actually, from the state's emergency management system, they got a report back from Helene saying, or from the FEMA, I should say, saying, hey, we've identified $2 billion worth of mitigation projects for Western North Carolina, making sure that it can withstand flooding in the future. And out of that $2 billion, less than $10 million has been funded so far. So we're talking just, $10 million, that's not nothing, but just a tiny fraction of the needs that exist. And they mentioned absolutely nothing for infrastructure, nothing to make sure that, if we get another big storm in the next hurricane season, that those roads that have just finished being rebuilt aren't going to get washed away again.
Let's take a quick break there. When we come back, we look into what these groups want from the federal government and the federal government's response to their complaints. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Luis Fernandez. We're joined by WRAL state government reporter Will Doran, who, Will, you're covering folks' complaints about the fundraising efforts for relief from Hurricane Helene. This is not the first time we've done this story, and I doubt this is going to be the last time we do this story.
Yes.
And it feels so rare to have a situation where you have activists, government officials who all kind of agree. They're coming together and saying, yes, this is the problem. So let's really get at that. Why are these groups blaming the federal government? You've mentioned the speed of the response. So what's slowing things down?
Yeah, well, part of it is that it seems, compared to past hurricanes, that the federal government is doing more to get in its own way. And, in the past, there have been some stumbles by the state as well. I mean, the problems with, response to those storms, Florence and Matthew, and, there were problems at the state government, there were problems in the federal government, there were problems in local government with that one. But really, because of those issues, the state had been much better about getting its stuff together in the immediate aftermath of Helene and quickly doing everything that it needed to do on its end to just put the ball in the federal government's court. And what we've seen is the federal government just not being able to get stuff done or not being willing to get stuff done. And what we've heard today and in the past, and this is not just Democrats complaining about Trump, this is Democrats and Republicans complaining about the Trump administration, is just that there's too much red tape. They said that Trump, especially in his second term now, has come in, he's publicly said he wants to get rid of FEMA, hasn't done it yet, but in the meantime, there have just been all of these new processes put in place to seemingly bog down and slow down the process, just make things harder to get done. The DOJ people have come in and they've added their own requirements that, according to some of our state officials, are adding an extra 30 to 90 days to every single grant application that they want to do. And, when you say, I want help with Helene recovery, it's not just one grant. I mean, we're talking thousands of grant applications. So, if you're adding 3 months onto each and every one of those, and some of them have to wait on the previous one to finish before they can start, then, you start to see how this can last years and years and years. So complaints with DOJ, complaints with FEMA, but there's also complaints with Kristi Noem, the cabinet official who's in charge of the Department of Homeland Security, which runs FEMA. And this summer, we reported, and other outlets have reported, that she instituted a brand new policy that she has to personally approve every single spending item that goes through DHS that's more than $100,000. And, to put this in perspective, DHS deals with a multiple hundreds of billions of dollars budget. They run FEMA, they run ICE, they run the borders for the country. They run a bunch of counterterrorism things, anti-money laundering investigations. They're a massive, massive agency. TSA. And so, every single thing that's over $100,000 having to go through one single person has understandably slowed down things a lot. So what we heard today was, for Helene, a lot of this stuff just does not get paid attention unless one of our U.S. senators, Tom Tillis or Ted Budd, personally intervenes and goes to Kristi Noem and says, hi, here's this thing that I want you to sign. And then what we heard today was that usually works. They can get it done. But again, when we're dealing with thousands of requests coming out of Western North Carolina, they can't go knock on our door 5,000 times or however many times it might need to be.
You do start to, the way you lay it out there, you really start to see, the potential problems with this. What is the federal government's response to all this? There's obviously been a lot of people, both with advocacy groups as well as local government officials, that have brought up frustrations with this. Have they responded in any way, kind of approached these concerns in any way?
Well, I have not heard back today from either FEMA or DHS. I've reached out to both agencies about all of these complaints, these accusations, see if there's anything they wanted to respond, or if they just had any advice for these complaining local officials here in North Carolina. Okay, you're worried about, how long we're taking. Here are some things you can do to make things go faster. I have not heard back from them. But I did reach out to the White House as well, and I heard back from a spokesperson from President Trump who told me that he is 100% committed to Western North Carolina. They mentioned that actually, one of the very first places, it might have actually been the first place he visited after his inauguration, was Western North Carolina. And, it's obviously an area that is heavily conservative and voted for him for both times that he went into office. It's one of the more conservative parts of a red state here in North Carolina. And he has not been back to Western North Carolina since then. But we actually have learned he's coming back to Rocky Mount in a couple of days. So we'll be there as well. We'll see if he has any updates to make about Western North Carolina as well when he's out there in Rocky Mount. But yeah, the White House says that he is fully committed to seeing Western North Carolina recover.
Okay, so you mentioned, any kind of possible discussion of this on Friday when President Trump is back in the state. Besides that, where does this go next? Where, is there any kind of timeline we could be looking at? Is there anything that can be done to get this funding into Western North Carolina faster?
Well, what we heard today from some of the local officials who were, on the ground dealing with this from their cities and counties is they are going to head up to D.C. After the holidays, get through Christmas, and then go up to Washington and start banging down some doors, I think was the direct quote that came out of the governor's advisory committee today to get some of this stuff fast-tracked. So, so far, letters and even more harshly worded letters and emails, have not really gotten the results they want. So maybe an in-person presence, banging down some doors up in D.C. will help get the ball moving. Well,
like I said, we've reported on the story already. We're talking about it now, and I don't think we're going to be stopped talking about this anytime soon in the future. I know you will be there covering it all. That is WRAL State Government reporter Will Doran. Will, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm Luis Fernandez. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and for making us part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.